There is a moment of truth where the artist faces the white canvas and you make the first move. And all of a sudden, you reveal yourself. I hope to discuss basic principles that I operate on, how I see working as an architect today, and some of the pitfalls, some of the issues that I'm confronted with, some of my fears about what's happening in the future. I guess we're always afraid of the future. Overall, sharing the way I play the game, what I'm interested in. It's not about trying to be like me, it's trying to be like being about themselves and finding their own way that I hope I'm promoting. I don't think you should become Frank Gehry, little Frank Gehrys, or big Frank Gehrys, or even medium Frank Gehrys. By showing you how I'm doing it and the thoughts that are in my mind as I'm working and the things that are important to me and the processes and how I interact with the clients and world around me, it gives you an idea of how an architect today has been working. I'm Frank Gehry, and this is my master class. Architecture, it chose me more than I chose it. When I was in high school in Canada, and they had vocational guidance books in the library of what different professions, I remember going to the library and studying all of them, and I picked architecture out because why, I don't know. And the University of Toronto class in architecture, they were very proud that one of the projects was to design a little cottage, like a little stone cottage with a fireplace. And I just closed the book and put it away. I wasn't interested in that. My cousin was a chemical engineer, and in my whole family, he was somebody I looked up to because he was a chemical engineer, and they talked about him as this big chemical engineer. I thought, well, I did good in chemistry, so maybe I'd do that. I signed up for vocational guidance in chemical engineering, and I was the only one in the class that signed up for it, so the scientist or the chemical engineer came, picked me up, took me out to his lab, and he was making paints for General Motors, I think. And they had a bunch of beakers and Bunsen burners and all kinds of stuff. It looked pretty exciting. And he let me stay there for a couple hours. And they were doing a thing called titration. So they do a test on something, very small variations, like tiny, tiny variations. And while I was there, they did 100 of them. Variations like dum, 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 dum. And they were testing all these things. And I looked at the guy and I said, "Get me out of here." So I knew I wasn't going to do that. I didn't have the patience for that. Family was poor. I was a truck driver. I went to night school and I took a class in ceramics. And the ceramics teacher, who was pretty well known at the time, Glenn Lukens, took me aside one day and said, "This ain't for you, but I think architecture might be." And he put me in a class, and he must have paid for the tuition because I couldn't afford it. Then it took off. That was the first time anybody liked anything I did. And certainly made me feel good, and I kept doing more. So it got me, but I suppose it was inevitable, but the signs were all there probably. When I talk to students, there's two things I advise them. One is to be themselves, and I talk about the writing your signature, that if you write a signature and your colleague writes their signature, you can recognize yours and they can recognize theirs. There is a you that's different from a him or a her. And it's worth pursuing because that's where you're the strongest and so on. And that plus making sure that everything you do, no matter how small, is the best you can possibly do. It's a small thing. It's about 2 inches long and ½ inch high or something. But in that little act of drawing that name, you reveal yourself. It happens automatically. You don't think about it, usually. I mean, people contrive their signatures and all kinds of stuff like that eventually. You get ego involved in what it looks like. But I'm talking about generally. And that difference is you. And so how did you feel when you wrote it? You didn't think about it. That's a prime example of a visual impact of your own persona. So when you take that to do assigning a building or a teapot or a light bulb or whatever things you're going to do, that persona's still in, if you let it be, if you don't self-consciously legislate it out, which some people do because they're embarrassed by it and have difficulties and feel insecure because some parent or some wayward school teacher tells you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to be that person. You're not allowed to be yourself. You're not allowed. You're here to do X, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and you got to do it this way. No, you don't. And no, you shouldn't. And you should enjoy finding yourself, and you should enjoy expressing yourself and being secure in it. They can reject you, and they will. And believe me, they will. And you gotta just keep doing it. I believe that having a healthy insecurity is crucial to doing the kind of work I want to do. I've compared notes with actors, musicians, composers, and see the same. My friend Esa-Pekka Salonen is an incredible composer, and he suffers so much from it. Sometimes we have to go out and have a drink and cry in each other's beer. I think that comes with the territory. I don't think it's a negative thing. I think it's something we feel comfortable with. And if it isn't there, we don't feel comfortable. As soon as I feel too secure about something, I know I'm on the wrong track. And that's hard to do, and people don't believe it because you get all this notoriety for doing stuff, which has happened to me a little bit. And it's hard for them to understand you're not, or I'm not, and I know a lot of my friends aren't, that insecurity is there always. And we rely on it. I rely on it. It keeps me motivated to keep doing stuff, and I don't dismiss it. I used to volunteer to go to elementary schools, just spend 3 or 4 hours with the kids, and I'd have them make a city. And so we'd make the city and put it on a, call it the library and the bookstore and the city hall and blah, blah, blah. And I showed them how to use the transit, the old way the surveyors use. They don't do that anymore. They got another fancier way now. And I took the dial out and showed them it was a protractor. And I said, so when you're learning protractor, this is what it's for, and this is how you use it. And then I asked them to calculate the area of the buildings. And so they'd never done that before, so I taught them math. They were open to that. And then you could say who runs the city, and you could teach civics. And you could get into philosophy, literature, music. You get into anything you want once you open that door. And it's very simple. It only took 4 hours. I think you can tap into people's creativity. And I think whether you become a doctor or a mathematician or a whatever, you still need that self-propelled creativity. You need to find yourself in it. After I finally got in architecture school, at the end of the first semester, second year, which they skipped me into, at the end of the first semester, my teacher called me in and said, Frank, this is not a profession for you. If I were you, I'd get out now. That guy became the architect administrator for the LAX airport, and I saw him often. And he would see me coming, and he would say, okay, I remember, don't remind me. So luckily, I had enough positive stuff in me that I overcame that. I didn't listen to him. I didn't quit. I kept going. When people say that to you, you shouldn't just cave in. Assess the person who's making the statement. The reporters don't report on the mediocrity. A mediocre building is built, they'll publish it in the real estate section, and no architectural critic will, even after 5 years, look at the 200 buildings that built and say, hey, wait a minute, this is junk. Instead, they'll wait till some young architect comes in with a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and who's struggled and made some kind of special thing, and they trash it without thinking about it, just because it looks a little different. And I think that's our reality in our profession. It's probably in everybody's profession. But there is a kind of strength that comes from that keeps you going. You know that guy, William Shakespeare? You've heard of him? And you heard of what he said, all the world's a stage, that comment. I think that's pretty true. We're all on stage, we're all actors, acting out our lives on stage. And the stage the background are the buildings we build. They should be human-friendly, respectful of people. They should engage you. So I would say 98% of the cities around the world don't do that. John Cage said, not knowing cheers the knowing. And I think that's pretty much my philosophy too. I have always felt that if you know what you're going to do in advance, then you won't do it. That's like jazz. They don't know exactly where they're going, and somebody plays a few notes, and then they pick up and they do it. And creativity, I think, in all fields, including business, including science, starts with the unknown. So you got to be curious. I think, and not be afraid to be curious. And you got to find your own voice. I mean, we can talk about it here on this in this kind of format. But if I have a New York City developer client that wants me to do a 70-story tower, and I tell him not knowing cheers to knowing, he'll kick me out of the room. So it's not something you can broadcast in a way. It's just the way you work. We live in a world that's basically a collision of thoughts is surrounding us. And it's represented in the buildings and in the music and the art. And so the idea of having a neat, clean box seems like a lie. The messiness is kind of a signature of the times, I think. So it's kind of logical that we would express that in when you build. And the pristine Misesian Farnsworth House idea is antithetical to that, to today. I get in trouble here because, a long time ago, Mies van der Rohe did the Farnsworth House in Illinois, and it's a beautiful sculpture. Everything is organized and spotless to conform to that aesthetic, and they can't escape it. And it's overpowering. The architecture would organize your life in maybe a negative way, an unfriendly way. The people who do it, God bless them, they love it and they feel comfortable in it. I think they have other houses that they can go to and throw their clothes on the floor and have their kids play in. But these pristine houses become like museum things. There's a lot of buildings like that are really beautiful architecture. So I'm not demeaning them by any means. But Mies van der Rohe himself lived in an apartment with all kinds of tchotchkes and books and stuff, and they're user-friendly. So I think there's a kind of comfort. You walk in, you want to sit on a couch, you want the light to be soft when you want it, you want the room not to be harsh, I think you can make architecture and still do that. It doesn't detract to make something comfortable. Now, the other kind of buildings exist. I mean, there are a lot of them that are ice cold. People with a lot of money tend to build those. I think they're trying to cleanse their sins or something. I don't know why they do that. The Walt Disney Concert Hall was designed as a place for people to experience music, for them to interact with some wonderful musicians and some wonderful music that had been handed down through the centuries. So I focused on making a place where people like to be there and like to be with other people, and that they sense the musicians and the musicians sense them. And there's a uplifting and positive feeling that the musicians feel from the audience feels from the musicians. People who give lectures know what I'm talking about. You go to lecture halls all the time, and some of them work and a lot of them don't. You just feel you're standing there on a stage and there's an audience out there, but you don't see them, you don't know them, there's no relationship to them. And I think it changes the quality of the interaction and the speech and the feelings of the experience. So I think you have to think about it. You have to consciously try to understand what makes somebody feel comfortable. Architecture is about creating the built environment. The built environment is being created for people to live in, use in, work in, sleep in, die in, study in, eat in, blah, blah, blah. As humans, we have certain comforting things that make us feel better, and there's a possibility of transferring humanity through inert materials. And my model for that was, years ago, I was in Delphi and I stood before the statue of the charioteer, 500 BC, and I looked at it for a bit and started crying because it was so beautiful, artist unknown. And I realized some person, 500 BC, built this statue out of inert materials, out of bronze, and through that process created an object so beautiful that it made somebody like me cry so many years later. And that this kind of transferring of feelings through inert materials over the ages was something that I aspired to. It made it clear what a mission could be for an architect, working with a complicated process of engineering, building codes, economics, how to manage all of that and put it together and at the end produce something that would transfer feelings. For me, that's the mission. If you free associate in life, you're not symmetrical. I don't go here and do this, and then you got to go over there and do this, mimic me. You don't do that. So we talk to each other, and there's a freedom in that relationship. Everything you do with form is compositional. You're always balancing where windows go, where lighting goes. But with asymmetry, you're freer, so you can free associate more, and it's more casual. It doesn't feel like an imposition. Symmetry says you got to do this. Sometimes a little imbalance is nice and engaging. I always think of it as more related to democratic values. I mean, that's kind of pompous, but it is. In a way, it's saying we're all in this together, and if you want to move over there and I'm going to move over here, that's going to be fine. If we want it to look good, we'll figure out a way to make it look good. You'll have a red hat and I'll have a blue hat. And if we need to balance it, maybe we don't, maybe we do. I don't think the rules are important. If you look at some of the greatest art ever, the Edo period screens from Japan, they ain't symmetrical. And I think that kind of freedom and expression in our built environments is a big plus, and we shouldn't lose it. If you're building a building in the middle of a city, there is, I think, a responsibility to respect your neighbor like you would anyway. So architecturally respect your neighbor. If somebody looks at Disney Hall, they say, hell, you just ignored everything around it. What are you talking about respect? You just made a big shiny thing and it gives the finger to the chandler. But it doesn't. I mean, if you spend some time with it, as you come down Grand Avenue, the chandler curves. So I opened the curve to the entrance, and I was careful to do that. I made the new building out of smaller parts, so it wasn't one big building like the chandler. So it wasn't competing as a chandler. It had its own body language. And so those moves are very small in the scale, but they do count for a lot. In the tower I did in New York, I was next to the Woolworth Building. The Woolworth Building is a beautiful old building. I have a lot of respect for it. And so I didn't put a cap on it. I respect the Woolworth Building has a beautiful sculptural cap on it. And I didn't want to mimic it. I wanted it to say, you got the hat, I'm respecting your seniority. And I think that kind of respect your neighbors architecturally is important to me. I looked at the material that was most used worldwide that everybody hated, and that was chain link fencing. And so I thought, okay, let me see if I can make something out of it that they'll like. Well, I got guffaws and everything for years. Today, even people who not really interested or intellectually involved, still look at it and say, oh, you're the chain link guy. A friend of mine built a tennis court. He made fun of me with chain link. I went to his house and he had a tennis court, which is surrounded in chain link, that you could see from every room of his house. He bought a fancy Bel Air mansion, and he was so proud of it. And he's the guy that made the most fun of me with chain link. And I went to look at it, and I said, gee, I'm sorry I converted you to that dastardly material. He said, what are you talking about? I said, that thing out there, that's chain link. He said, no, that's a tennis court. I was designing a entrance piece for a house I was doing in Ohio for a wealthy guy, a good friend. And when you see the final thing, you think it's a skull of a animal like a horse. And so we call it the horse's head. But when I was designing for this guy's house, and I didn't know it was a horse's head, and I didn't know it was going to look like that, I sort of was trusting my intuition to create something that was an ephemeral image in my mind that I couldn't quantify or draw. I could sketch and do things with it. But in this case, I tried to design it on the computer because I realized if we could do that, that would save a lot of time and effort and so on. So I sat in front of the computer with a computer guy who knew how to push the buttons because I didn't know how to do that. We clocked it. Somebody clocked it. It was 3.4 minutes when I got up and ran out screaming and couldn't stand it anymore because the disconnect between the dream image and the images on the computer, which are dried out and lifeless and inhumane and what else, they're just geometry and drawings and they don't have the human touch. The difference was so wide, the gulf was so wide, and I was trying to connect them in my head, and I couldn't hold it for longer than 3.4 minutes. I got up and went out screaming. I said, don't do this to me again. I think the human contact, the sketch, the hand-eye coordination, the machine on its own will eliminate the humanity, left to its own devices. A friend of mine did the Piero della Francesca from Arezzo, the frescoes. And she spent 10 years putting that information in the computer so they could reproduce the frescoes electronically with all of the humanity and feeling of Piero della Francesco's hand and eye and motion and all the things that went with him producing that painting. If you circumvent all that stuff and just go computer to construction, you eliminate the human touch. And it's subtle, I think. And you see a lot of it. We're going more and more that way. The buildings are becoming even more faceless and less inviting the nice thing is they put trees all over them, so that helps. And people still laugh and cry and act up, and so you can't eliminate that yet. There is one thing that a teacher told me. I think I mentioned this earlier somewhere. He took me aside and he said, you know, I've been watching you and you're really talented. And that was the first time anybody said that to me, by the way. And that took me by surprise. But he said that, and he said, promise me that whatever you do going forward, no matter how small it is, whatever project you make or build or design, make sure it's the best you could possibly do for that work. You're judged always by each step along the way. That was a big deal for me, and I've never forgotten it. And I've lived by that. So even when I was in the Army and I was designing field latrines for maneuvers in the swamps of Louisiana, I was seriously designing, and the Army couldn't care less but I made it a serious thing. I really worked hard, and I'm proud of those field latrines. I don't know if the general ever used them, but it was the best I could do. Knowing when you're done maybe is the hardest thing. It's a self-editing process that requires an understanding of all of the other issues. So you accept a schedule when you start a project. So when you get to that date, you know you're done. But having that in mind as you work and you're working to that schedule, it kind of sets you up for knowing when you're done, because you know that going past that date is going to be a difficulty for the other members of your team, the people who are paying for it. The house we're doing now in Atherton, we set a done date, and it's tough. And the client is demanding a done date, and we're respecting that. It's a reasonable done date. If you get to the done date and the building isn't what you want, you would pray to the client and say, please give me another week or something. I'm almost there. I mean, I've had that happen, where you know you're almost there but not there, and you want to just beg for a little more time. I think it's healthy to have a done date, because otherwise you'll go on forever. And I've seen that happen with young people sometimes don't have the discipline. In my case, I was drafted into the Army. I spent 2 years being disciplined. I think it was a healthy thing to have happen, probably. So everybody join the Army. I never know they're going to be a success, and I never presume they are. But I try to make them a success. The Basque people that I met with when I was hired to do Bilbao was the mayor, the president of Basque region, the minister of commerce, the minister of culture, the minister of education, and the Guggenheim director. And I was asked if I could make a building that would have the same effect on Bilbao as the Sydney Opera House had on Sydney, Australia. And I looked at them and I said, wow, that's a big order. I said, look, I'll try my best. I don't know what that means. I'll do my best. So I didn't know that it was going to work out. I'm still I listen to all the success stories. I don't dine out on it. When people ask about it, I talk about it. Or when I get pushed in a corner and about what I'm doing, and I can refer to it. I bring that to my defense sometimes. But I think you should aim for success. You should aim for those are client requests. I mean, those guys really asked me for that, and I looked at them and I said, "You got to be kidding!" It's like, who do you think I am? But I'll do my best. That's all you can say. The gods were with us, and it happened. But I think there's a certain degree of naivete that to be told that and look at them and say, okay, I'm going to try. And you think, and you leave that room and you think, oh my God, what am I going to do now? Because you're taking on a kind of a impossible responsibility that you can't guarantee. And how dare them ask you to do that? They know it's inhuman. There's all kinds of feelings that come with that moment. And you want to go home, crawl under the covers and hide. I think there's an expectation from the client that right now, because of my career, the past, that when they come, they expect that kind of reaction or response. You have to maintain a level of optimism that you're going to be able to pull it off. You're going to be able to create the building that they expect and exceed their expectation and meet their. I mean, you have to approach it with that optimism and sense of responsibility that goes with it, I think. But I love that. I love that space. I've come to love that space. From jazz, the greatest thing I've heard anybody say is Wayne Shorter, who said, you can't rehearse what you ain't invented yet. And it's so true, because the creative process is when you're doing a building, you're trying to pull it out of somewhere. And it's like jazz. You respond and you work intuitively to create something. And it evolves, and often it just starts to appear, and you don't know where it's coming from. And you go with it. You trust it. You don't leave it. You don't overthink it. You just go with it, and it takes you somewhere. It's a great experience. When you're finished, you look at it, you say, where the hell did that come from? How did I get that? God damn it, that's so great, Don't tell anybody I didn't know what I was doing. We had a physics teacher, Joe Noble was his name, in the 11th grade. We would stay after school, he would stay after school, and we would sit and talk about all these kind of things. And he egged us on. We used to fantasize some crazy things, like this is crazy, okay? So if you have two trains coming on the track, they're equal size, and they hit each other, what happens? They stop dead, right? So now you have the same one train, and then you have half a train, and you hit it, so then this gets pushed that way a little bit. And so as this train gets smaller and smaller, this train pushes it further, but they always stop it. So then we wondered if a fly could stop the train, taking that logic. Well, we spent months thinking about that. People still remind me and make fun of me from that period. Obviously, a fly can't stop a train, but we really believed it could back then. I think that's important, is to take the risk of doing something, even though you know Oh, come on, you're never going to stop a fly. A fly's going to stop a train. But let's see how big a thing has to be to stop the train. Where's the line? And then what can you do with that information? So there are similarities when you project images. Like now we're doing a house with a brick facade. The brick doesn't hit the ground, it's in suspension. That's stupid to do that because the brick is heavy. You shouldn't do that. So we were going to kill it. We weren't going to do it. And then I couldn't get it out of my mind. I couldn't stop. So now the house is being designed and the client loves it so far. And it's working. We're making it work. Create the logic for it as you go. And it's like doing something with brick that hasn't been done, I don't think. Why do it, though? Why would you do that? Why pursue it? Why? Because it goes back to this background for humanity. It's background for living. It's a different kind of expression. And it gives a different stage set, if you will. And brick has all kinds of connotations to people. And so they haven't seen it done like this. So they'll accept it because it's a material they know. And then you start to stretch it into another place. If you're relentless, you can make the fly that stops the train. There is a moment of truth where you make the first move, where the artist faces the white canvas. I think it's exhilarating, and usually it comes out okay, not always. And I have trouble sometimes going back. I mean, I'll see something I did 10 years ago that looks better than what I'm working on now, and I freak out. I wonder why I abandoned that early thing. I had it, and I left. The train left the station, we went somewhere else. And I think it's because once you've done it, you feel dishonest somehow of taking something you've already done for something and using it again. It feels like a weakness. So, and that may be an issue that we should all talk about, because it's probably not a weakness and probably something that would be worth doing. But, you know, our culture says, well, you don't want to repeat yourself, but everything has to be different and new and changed. Mies van der Rohe, one of the best architects of the last century, did the same building over and over again. And you wonder what joy he had in it. Why did he do it? I never met him, so I couldn't ask him. But then you take the time to go look at those buildings, like the Lakeshore Towers are the black steel buildings. And guess what? They come down to the ground and sit on a piece of travertine that's 1 7/8 inch thick. And it's just this platform, and it's so powerful. So there are these little victories, these little things that's a big deal. You know, nobody's repeated it even. It's so beautiful and elegant, and, you know, I'd like to hug him for just that. Often we indulge ourselves with the issue of creative block. I find that an inexcusable position. It's all creative block. You're always blocked. It's never different. And if you succumb to it and quantify it and name it, I can't think of it. Oh my God, I can't think of it. I don't have an idea. Oh, I got to go rest. I got to take a weekend off. And that's all baloney, I think. I think you're always in creative block. It's a waste of time. So my advice is forget about creative block and just assume you're always blocked and you don't know what the hell you're doing anyway. So just keep trying things and things will evolve. Henry James, I think, said that creativity is like having a big stick in a deep barrel of something, and you turn the stick and turn it around and turn it around. You pull it up and look, and all of a sudden, there's a great idea. I think it's that ephemeral, it's that magical, it's that stupidly primitive and interesting and exciting. Creative block is an excuse out of fear for delaying, for procrastination. And I don't think it's relevant. I think you should forget about it. You can have epiphanies where you have ideas, but I don't trust them right away. I want to test them. So it's not a eureka moment. It's more like this looks interesting. Let's see where it goes. It varies because designing a building is over a period of time. And so some days I hate it. And I look at it and I find that a positive thing. And we call it that in the office. We say we got to look at it long enough till we hate it. We take the next step from there. And I have sleepless nights about it. I actually wake up at night and worry that we're not going to get there. There's a lot of anxiety with it, I think. You got to take the risk. A typical work day, I think every day is atypical, but it's changed as I've gotten older and as the office has gotten better organized, and we're always in touch. So there's not a lot of, except for the sleeping hours, there's not a lot of detachment. I get messages on into the night, especially from Europe and places where we're working. Typically, I go in and complain about everything. I sort of make the rounds. I visit the projects that I know are waiting for my work, my being there. On a good day, when everything's working, I'll go for 2 or 3 projects during the day. I don't break for long lunches or anything. The office does, but I don't usually. It's 15 minutes at the most, unless we have a lunch meeting. I like to get into it and work. As I've said before, you don't know where you're going. It's like Wayne Shorter said, you can't rehearse what you ain't invented. So we make models, and so while I'm not there, the models are being remade based on the meeting that day, and then we sit with the new model and agonize about what we like and what we don't like. And sometimes I'll wait till everybody's gone and I'll spend time alone, like they did the other day. I went to the office and there was nobody there, and I spent 3 or 4 hours just looking at the model. And then the next day when the staff was there, I was able to talk about where to go because I digested it somehow. Now I couldn't write you down a series of events or of decisions that were made that led to because it is like jazz. You are experiencing things as you go and modifying your thinking moment by moment as you make a decision and then look at it and then make the next move and then make the next move and then build on it and then you look at it until you get angry with it, and then that allows you to go forward. We just keep looking at it and see the things that are sort of personal cliches that we've done before, or things that we don't want to repeat, or just don't like certain relationships, and you keep pushing things and looking at it, talking about it with the crew, getting their feelings, listening to, taking a bunch of phone calls. There's a lot of procrastination as you go because you find you're starting to get somewhere and then you're not sure about it, and then you take a call or allow yourself to be interrupted because you're not sure where you're going, and then you build up enough courage to go back. It's an interesting process. I don't know how it's perceived by others as they see it, but I think overall the people in the office get to understand and learn to play with me. I'm influenced by a lot of people. I read a lot of stuff. I look at a lot of stuff. And I think that encourages and engages one, and I don't think you can substitute anything for it. You have to be curious and search out these great works from the past, not to copy them, but to at least understand what it meant. I was fascinated with the fold. I mean, everybody through the history of art and architecture has been fascinated with the fold. Michelangelo spent a great part of his time drawing folds. It's primitive because when you're a child, you're in your mother's arms and the fold is. So there was something magical about exploring that idea in something as concrete as a building. I have a very close friend, Irving Lavin, who's professor of art history, who is an expert on Michelangelo and Borromini, Bernini, and all those guys. And he and I travel, and his wife and my wife, we travel occasionally to go look at stuff. And he took me to Dijon and introduced me to Klaus Schluter. There is a sarcophagus of Philip the Bold, and surrounding it are figures by Schluter, Klaus Schluter, that are rarely seen. If you look at those, you can begin to see where the influence on this conference room. In this case, I was very inspired with that one piece. If you look at the front, the nose right head on of that piece, you'll see the Schluter dip that he made with the hoods. They came over the heads of the monks, and there's a little dip like that. It's quite beautiful. And I didn't realize that I'd literally taken it till later. In my early days in practicing architecture in Los Angeles, I became very close to the local art scene, they called it. There were a lot of artists that became my friends. I was interested in their work. I was personally close to them and to their work, and I watched them create their work, and they watched me create my work, and there was a kind of synergism between us. Even though they were separate, they were separate but equal, so to speak. And in my formative years of practice, that was an important thing. At Harvard, I was exposed to Corbusier. There were people from Corb's office working there, were teaching at Harvard. Corbusier had a show of his paintings, and I looked at those paintings, and I didn't like the paintings. I thought they were all over the place. But then I saw the designs for Ronchamp, and the little church near the Swiss border. And it's so beautiful. It came out of those studies of the paintings. I could see a direct line from the paintings to the building. It made me realize that at least this architect could work out through another media. I mean, like Michael Heiser is really an incredible artist who I look to. He grew up with a father who was an archaeologist, and so Michael, in his early years, experienced Egypt and the scale of those constructions. And he emulated in his work with double negative. He's an intellectual primitive. I'm very attracted to that kind of thinking. Where do the influences come from? If you see a painting and you can't forget it, and you start riffing off it, even if you don't know it, if you subconsciously do it, is to trust it and to explore it. The most important thing, takeaway, is to be yourself and not try to be me or anybody else. You can be inspired by characters like me and people like Bob Smithson, his philosophy, his writings, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe and Corbusier and Bob Venturi and Rem Koolhaas and Tom Main and all kinds of people who are working in the field. Those are wonderful people to study and to understand. But in the end, it's got to be you, your conscience, your talent, your mind, directed to creating a building or an environment that other people are going to use, and that has a responsibility of being a good neighbor and has a responsibility of keeping the rain out and being a place where people can comfortably live, work, play, all the things you do in buildings, and be inspired by the building and be nurtured by the building and have the experience of the building be a positive and uplifting one. As a practicing architect, you are constantly confronted with constraints. Gravity is one of them. Budgets are a big one. Who's the client, their expectations, who you're working with. There's a lot of room for creativity outside that, you know. You can meet all those constraints and still make architecture out of it. Years ago, I was sitting at dinner next to Sidney Pollack, and I was full of myself in those days. I was a lot younger, and I was feeling like nobody respected artists and architects and blah, blah, blah. Here was this big movie guy who's made all these great films, And so I was very judgmental, and I was kind of an asshole. And I ventured to say to him, you just do that stuff. There's no art in it, nothing. And Sidney, who was a spectacular human being and great guy, was very patient with me. He turned to me and said, "That's not true, Frank." He said, when I make a Western film for Hollywood, I got constraints. There's a pro forma I have to follow. And he said, there's no question. I can't make it unless there's the hero. He's got to ride to town. He's got to do blah, blah, blah. But he says, within all those constraints, I have 15% of freedom to make my art. And I looked at him, and I went home that night, and I called him the next day, and I said, that's exactly how much, the same percentage I have. And so we became fast friends after that. But I think everybody faces it in their work. The constraints are constraints. I mean, they're opportunities to explore things. And some great movies have been made, some great buildings have been made, even some great legislation has been written throughout the constraints and with the constraints. There are times when you work on projects, they're very complicated. The length of time from the day you're hired to a project complete could be at least 6 or 7 years. Things happen in the world during that 6 or 7 years. Sometimes economies go up and down. Things that change which have a serious effect on what you're doing and are things that you're no control over. You're in the middle of, it's like you're in the middle of a sentence and you're just finishing the sentence and cut. And now what? On the tower in New York, we were at the 40th floor and we were told, cut, that's as high as they're going. 76-story tower, they're going to stop it at 40, so it's going to be a stub. I had a meeting with the client in a restaurant looking across the river at the stub. Client was devastated, I was devastated, everybody. We had a few drinks, devastating drinks. We were caught. She was caught, I was caught, they were caught. I mean, it wasn't anything, no malice or forethought. It was the economy dumped. It was 208, and everybody went sideways. A couple of weeks passed, and a woman that worked for the client, who was senior, she took the risk and made it happen. So as you're working in real life, in real time, you're constantly having small victories and small mistakes, and it just goes on. The important thing is to keep moving ahead and learning from the mistakes and building on it, building positive momentum from that, because it is a very complex endeavor. A lot of it is life and death, security. You go down paths with materials and things that you think are going to work and you find they don't, and you have to recoup and re-understand, regroup, find another option, and you're constantly evaluating, reevaluating directions, mistakes, and opportunities, and bad advice, all kinds of things. Because you got a lot of people involved. You got engineers, mechanical engineers, structural engineers. You have to, it's like a puzzle. You have to put it all together, and it's got to fit at the end perfectly and be a building that everybody likes. was interested in expressing movement with inert materials. The Greek sculptors did it. Elgin marbles. If you look at those warriors, they're pressing into the stone, and you can feel the pressure of them today. That message gets through. The power of it gets through. The horses look like they're running. The fabric looks like it's wafting in the breeze. It still feels like it's moving. Bernini's Santa Teresa in Rome, it feels like a fabric. It feels warm and inviting. The fold is the basic child experience in his mother's arms with the closed folds. It's so basic to our understanding and our first feelings of love and warmth. And Michelangelo spent a lot of his life drawing folds. The old guys were fascinated. In fact, most of the paintings, the great paintings of the years past, the portraits have the little head on top, and they spent time making that portrait. But the dress and the costumes with the folds is where they spent most of their art time. And I urge you to spend more time looking at the folds than the faces. The Museum of Modern Art had a show on Beaux-Arts. And it was just at the point where all of my architecture brethren were running out of ideas in modernism because the dead end of the minimalism thing struck everybody. Malevich took minimalism in his life all the way to the black square. And then he had nothing to do after that. He didn't know what to do after that. So he quit because it was a dead end. And he started making costumes. And lo and behold, the Museum of Modern Art has these beautiful, beautiful renderings of Beaux-Arts buildings. And the seduction was complete. And Philip Johnson did the AT&T building, and Bob Stern took off. You name it. Everybody was doing postmodern and regurgitating the past. And some of it very successfully and some of it very beautifully. But I was offended because we were looking backward. And in a lecture I gave, I said, the Greek temples you're emulating are anthropomorphic. And if you really have to go back, why don't you go back 300 million years to fish? And that just came out automatically. I don't know why. And then I started drawing fish in my sketchbooks. Just, I don't know why. I started drawing them because I said that. And then I realized that Hiroshige drew beautiful fish drawings of the carp, and there are many Japanese prints that I'd seen and loved with carp and flowing tails and fins and that kind of stuff. And I started drawing fish everywhere, just in my sketchbook. I never intended to build them. Buildings that looked like fish. And then I was invited by a fashion house in Italy to make a fish sculpture. They'd seen my fish drawings and they said, could you make a fish sculpture for a fashion show? And I said, of course. And I went to Cinecittà in Roma, and I got them to build a fish that was 35 feet long in wood with the tail and the fins and the eyes, and it was a super piece of kitsch. It was embarrassing. And I had a hole in it and put some of the fashion figures inside, like Jonah and the whale, and some of the fashion figures outside. And I was standing beside the fish with a director of one of the Dutch museums who hated my work. So he was standing there, and I knew he hated my work. and we're looking at this enormous piece of kitsch, and I thought, man, I'm giving this guy fuel for the fire. And he says to me, how'd you do that? And I said, what are you talking about? He said, I think it moved, and which I'd experienced as well. And he said, could we have a coffee? And so we went down, and this guy who hated me then proceeded to talk to me for an hour about how I created movement with this bloody piece of kitsch, which is what I was trying to do, but I didn't know I'd done it. So that egged me on. I then had an opportunity to do a show at the Walker Museum of my work, and I decided to make the fish, and I cut the tail off, and I cut the head off, and I got rid of the fins, and I made it in lead copper, and it still moved. When you stood beside it, you felt the movement. So that was my eureka moment. And then I started playing with the curved forms, which led to Bilbao, and which in my mind was expressing movement, that the idea that these shapes didn't appear static. They had a sense of movement, and therefore that was the replacement for the dead end of minimalism and decoration. Period. When you're working with a client, you're working with people. They have feelings, they have needs. It changes from day to day. They may have seen a picture in a magazine that you would hate, but they came and say, look, I want to do this. So it's nonlinear. You got to be willing to roll with punches. I think of it as you're steering the boat, your hands on the tiller. It's subtle when you're sailing. It varies constantly, and things happen, and you have to be open to it. That's the excitement to us, is to get people really involved, because if it's a house, it's going to be their place to live. So I don't like just making a sculpture and say, okay, here it is, take it or leave it, and move in. Every project you do, it's important to develop a trust relationship with the client where they know that you're working for them. You're bringing your art form to them. It's not unlike there's Pampas, but Michelangelo with Pope Julius. He was doing the paintings that Pope Julius asked him to, but he was doing them his way. We get a client, somebody calls us and says they want to do something. Let's make it simple, call it a house. They have a property somewhere in a canyon or on a beach or somewhere. They have a family, they have a certain budget. We try to find out who the people are, what are their values, what are their art collection, how they live, what their dream is for this particular dwelling, what part of the site is, why they chose the site, why they chose me, just a getting to know you kind of a period. We have a client now for a house whose background is Iranian. She has a different model for a family compound than a lot of different cultures. And so to get into that and create the privacy that she needs from her family, and that allows for the communal activity, all of that starts at the beginning. I start to understand these people and what they like, what their values are, how they talk to each other. And during that period, we sit and sketch. I mean, I can't help it. I just always have a pen or pencil in my hand and some blank paper, and I'm thinking with them out loud as to, the usual spaces, living room, dining room, bedroom, blah, 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 and starts to develop a story about that inspires a kind of a visual response, an organizational response, an architectural response, a kind of a spatial response. And I'm not talking about 6 months of meetings. I'm talking about 3 or 4 meetings, visit to the site, visit to their house they live in, maybe go out to dinner to their favorite restaurant. Just 3 or 4 meetings like that, you start to establish a rapport that is comfortable for both sides. I mean, it's not that complicated. It's just being aware that there's a lot of nuance in different cultures, different lives. It's obvious there is, so use it, get to know it, play it, make it a value and make it richer. And that's what'll make it different, and that's what'll make it personal for them. Take the time to understand your client. Take the time to understand what their needs are. When you're through, boy, they'll love you, and you'll get another job because of it. I think you need to, if you want to really do something for them, you have to really understand it, because what you're going to do is distill all this information into a program, and the program is going to have square footage attached to it, and the square footage has a dollar number attached to it. And at any time when you're doing a residence at a particular time, like in this period today, a private residence would be like, you would say, budget for like $1,000 a square foot would be not a fancy house, but a fairly reasonable. When I was a kid, it was $100 a square foot. So it changes over the years, and you have to understand what that is and discuss that reality with the client so that they understand what they're getting into. If they can't afford it, you try to make it compact. Usually by the time they get to me, they have the means to do at least $1,000 square foot. Some of them sometimes people want more luxurious materials, and you can double this amount of money. You talk about mechanical systems. How do you want to heat and air condition, ventilate? Really stupid stuff like that, but it relates to the what's going on now with sustainability issues. I think you have to stay real with your economics and their economics all the way through. Even if they're the richest people in the world, don't presume that. They have a budget for this building, and you have to respect it. With every architect comes our fingerprints, our aesthetic, our way of doing things. And so we can mold them to a client, we can modify them, and I love that where we get pushed. But a lot of people like very spare, elegant, pristine environments, and there are architects that love to do that, and they should go there. I've gotten that far with a client once or twice where I realized I'm in the wrong place and they're in the wrong place, and we stop and cut it off. And then I suggest another architect that's more likely to be doing the kind of work that they would be interested in. We build a site model at 2 or 3 scales, depending how complex. The first models are 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch scale allows you to get into the rooms. 1/8 inch allows you to mess with the site. So, and you work back and forth. I mean, there's no law to it. I may get going and ramp up and build a much larger model even. The rooms are blocked out, so you know that a living room is like at least, 14 to 16 feet wide, and it could be 20 to 30 feet long, say. So we make a block like that. That's a normal kind of. And we make blocks for bedrooms. We kind of know what sizes. And you just place them there. They're not that they're a final or anything. They're just talking points. These are abstract blocks of wood or whatever that we place on the site and manipulate, move around to get the best vantage points, to get the best interaction with each other, to get the best access, the most privacy, the viewpoints, all of it's during that process you discover how you're going to work on this particular piece of land. When you place them together, you start to conglomerate them. You can see how they interact, and you start to get these relationships. You start to understand how you should enter the house, how you should park, where should the back door be, where should the doggy door be, where should the service entrance be, where should the wine cellar be. And it's also how you discover the interaction of the client to that. You get their responses, because they're looking at the land too, and they're saying, you love that view, Frank, but that's not why we bought this house. We bought this house because we want a lot more privacy, and we want the view to be like a painting that you see only from one room, and we want it to be a drop-dead, gorgeous, natural painting. And other than that, that's it. So I'm exaggerating, but that could be a possible discussion. So, and it's during that period you explore options with them, and they begin to see options they hadn't seen. They begin to understand the site and their program to the site in a more personal way. They start you're educating them so that they can respond to you. The materials that we have available to us at any one time relate to what's in the culture, what's being built and what's being used. So if you had to build a very inexpensive house in the last 40 years, you would end up using stucco because you build a frame and you put stucco on it. Budgets mostly would lean you toward, on a big house, to use plaster because it's the scale of residential work. When I started with my house in the 70s, wherever I did it, our budget was $50,000 for that house. So whatever notoriety I got was for $50,000, pretty cheap. We used corrugated metal and wood and glass. But I think you have to want to do that. You have to say, there's got to be something better. So we got to look for it. The technical work is ongoing. Like we have access to these people. They're in the office, and they're 2 desks away or 3 desks away. So we'll call them and say, hey, what do you think? Can we go down this way, or can we study something? Or I have them at the end of the day evaluate work that we've done and see if there's anything standing out that we missed, that we didn't catch from a technical standpoint, or are we focusing on the right issues from a budget standpoint? So it's a kind of having a constant critique which we do ourselves, but having another point of view from somebody who's going to have to build the thing. And that usually leads to, if it's something new that we're, like when we're studying the brick, then they'll go off and get a whole bunch of brick samples and energize a bunch of study concurrent with what we're doing. So they'll start asking questions. And then, if you're working on a glass curtain wall, then they'll call up the curtain wall people that we've been successful with, and try things. Can we do this? Is there a way here? Is there a way? And so we do that right as we're working, so we don't get caught in a 6-month delay, and then we find out we can't do it. So we try to vet stuff as we go. I like to develop it with the client over time, so that by the time they go into it, it's theirs. They feel it. They know it. They know why it happened. They know why they got it there, and and what are the values of it. And for the most part, it feels comfortable to them. They should know that you're seriously listening to them, and that you care about them, and that you're going to make sure they're, as best you can, they're going to get what they need with their product, what's going to make their lives richer. It's all about making people happier, richer, friendlier, so they stop building fences and stop separating ourselves and stop buying guns. When I was starting on something like Disney, the Walt Disney Concert Hall, starting out, I didn't have the power to make some of the demands on the situation. The client group hired a project manager. The client group hired an executive architect, somebody I approved, but an executive architect who had all the political connections, so that his office was considered the adult, and I was the decoration on the side. The mistake was to not draw a line in the sand. I said it publicly in the meeting, and it was recorded in the meeting notes. I said, we're heading for a disaster. You better do something about it. Nobody would look at it. They read everything the way they wanted. They said the executive architect was 60% complete with his drawings, so they could go out and get steel bids. And I said the executive architect was only 30% complete with his drawings, and you couldn't get steel bids. They went ahead and did it. They got steel bids. They ordered steel. The executive architect couldn't keep up with the project, and it failed. And they lost, I think, $60-some million. And it was all beyond my control. I warned it. I pre-warned it. I did everything I could to prevent it. It did fail, and guess who got blamed? Me. So for 2 years in Los Angeles, I would go to dinner or do something and meet somebody who would inevitably come over to me and say, how could you have done that? That was terrible. And it got to the point where I started looking for office space on the East Coast to move my office. The client hired an outside consultant to analyze what went wrong. And they hired the developer Hines, Jerry Hines, to do the forensics. And they were working on it for a week, and then this big Texan guy who was a partner in Hines came to see me. And I thought, do I really need this, what he's going to say? I'm sure he's part of the, oh yeah, you architects don't know how to. Well, anyway, he came in. He looked at me. He said, "Mr. Gary, you've been fucked." And I looked at him and I hugged him. He said he knew exactly, he did the forensics, he knew exactly what happened, and he told the client group what happened. He told the bureaucracy what happened. My relationship to the project changed after that. On the second go-around, I was told that they were going to use my design and build it, that I should shut up and let them do it. That was on Friday afternoon. On Monday afternoon, I got a call from the person that told me I was no longer needed. And he said, "I hope you're not going to be a sore winner." I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, Diane Disney Miller, who was the daughter of Walt, who I didn't really know very well, was on the board, and she said that the rest of her family bequest for the concert hall would be given to them when I approve it." And so I was back in the chair, and I got to build it. It was a miracle. The relationship between orchestra and audience is important. And anybody who's given a talk in any auditorium, any time, knows how important that is. Be in an auditorium, give a talk, and you feel, you know that you don't have any contact with the audience. If you've experienced that, you know what I'm talking about. So we worked on that. So people in the audience really feel a relation to the orchestra, and the orchestra feels that they are feeling it and relates to them. So they play better, and then the audience likes it better. It's a positive, puts a positive spin on everything, and it works. What I always look for is the humanity of it. What's the relationship between audience and performer? How did other people handle that? And certainly the Berlin Philharmonic, the main hall, has that. When you go to the Berlin Philharmonic, it's concrete floor, pipe rails, not even painted. It's pretty raw, and it's very engaging. When you sit in the audience, you're with the orchestra in the same room. You feel it, and the relationship between the orchestra and the audience is spectacular. You look at it and you wonder, why is this working like this? Because it doesn't look like it would, but it does. And so it seems like a magic trick. You know, how did he do it? And I went there a lot of time. I spent a lot of time in Berlin, enough to go to 5 or 6 concerts to really digest it and figure it out for myself. We went to Leipzig, Gewandhaus, which the same acoustician had done. It didn't work. The sight lines didn't work and everything, but it's a revered hall, so I couldn't figure out why it was. What moved me was the Concertgebouw, because it really felt good. Behind the orchestra, there was a sloped seating of 700 seats. It was strange, because when the conductor came in, he got applause, and if people came in, if they were walking behind him, they thought they were getting the applause. It's kind of crazy thing, but acoustically it works. And I use that as a starting point. So you can see it's a squarish shape, and you can see where I went off it. They led to these kind of spaces. We finally honed into the simpler box. This is pretty close to the finished model. The acousticians from Japan had figured out how to really hone in on how to guarantee the acoustics. What they did, which somebody should have done earlier, is they built a 1 to 10 model of the great concert halls that worked. They built them and they sealed them and they filled them with nitrogen and they put sounds in and they tested every seat. And then they had a basis for comparison. And then every model we did, when we finally selected the final, we built a 1 to 10, and they did the same thing. So we built a 1 to 10 and put figures in it. They all looked Japanese. It was funny. And filled it with nitrogen, and then they played Mozart in it and gave me a copy of the sound. And it was kind of bogus, I thought, but we had the 1 to 10 model in our office. And every conductor that came to LA Phil, we put him in the 1 to 10 model. So we put Pierre Boulez in there one day. He was in for a couple hours. We gave him a sandwich. He was curious whether it worked. And at one point I went by and he went like this. And he said, it's going to work. So I said, okay, if he said so. I trusted him more than anybody. So the Japanese found a way to make something that could be criticized, could be evaluated critically, and you could count on. The first go-around, we designed it in stone because a metal building in the evening is hard to light. It's like a cheap refrigerator somehow. A stone building, and you've seen this in the historic buildings in Europe, the stone at night glows. It has a wonderful soft light even from the local street lamp, so you don't really have to light it. And it was $5 million less to put a metal around this than the stone. So the powers that be insisted that I change to metal. So let me take you back to the outside of the building. There's a box on each side, and you can see it in a little model I got here. I don't know how close I have to get to show you. So the box on either side are toilets, stairways, and they have to join around the front so that there's a foyer in front, and this joins around, and here's the box in the middle. And that's all we did. That's the scheme. And all we did with these boxes on the side is instead of the metal came out like this, that far, if it came out straight, I just took that piece and twisted it out that much and got that wave. I was trying to give it a sense of movement, and that was feeling. So it wasn't just an inert box. It had some kind of We got a lot of complaints over the years from the people about the restrooms, that not being enough restrooms. Not me, but the Philharmonic did. And I heard a lot of it because I went to a lot of concerts, and I'd see the women lining up and the men not. So I was a bad boy. I snuck extra women's restrooms into the project without anybody noticing. And now if you go to the hall, the men are lining. Not so bad, but the women know that I did that. And man, am I the favorite. The people on the board and the people that know what I did. While this was being built. No seats in it, stage wasn't there. I was in the hall watching it being constructed, and I kind of calculated in my mind that there was the same amount of absorption and reflective surface that there would be when it's finished. And I got all excited about it, and I called Esa-Pekka Salonen, our conductor, and said, could you meet me at the hall? I think we could get a sense of what it's going to be like. And since neither of us has the patience to wait till it's finished, if you're up for it. And I said, could you bring a musical instrument? He said, fine. So we met at 5 o'clock on the construction site with hard hats. And my son Sam came. And Esa-Pekka brought the first violinist with his violin with a hard hat. Esa-Pekka and my son and I sat here, right up at the top. And Martin Chelfer, the first violinist, stood on a piece of wood right at the edge of where the stage would be. And he started to play unaccompanied Bach. And we grabbed each other's hands and started crying because it was so beautiful. And the sound that we heard was pretty close to what we finally got. So it was interesting. It gets very emotional, these things. When the hall opened, the first rehearsal, Ernest Fleischman, the director, and Deborah Borda, who was succeeding him, and myself sat in the first, right here, first row of the orchestra. And the full orchestra was on stage, and I was watching the bass player because I knew that the most subtle thing that had to happen is the bass response in the sound, because that was missing in the Chandler Hall where they played before. So I had my eye on that guy. And the first few chords, he did this to me. Then they played for a few minutes, and Esa-Pekka stopped them and turned around and said, we'll keep it. So those experiences are for life. Those are the kind of wonderful things that you get if you do your work and enjoy it and get emotionally involved with the projects. I think that's one of the real great things about being an architect. When you're meeting with the client, first talk about their reality and then show them what the changes from that you're proposing and what the delta of costs will be, and have them think through whether that's a valuable thing or not. This is a building in New York on 8 Spruce Street. We started with very blocky realities. We asked the client to hire the architect who does all the buildings, the standard apartment buildings in New York, to make a model of what would be the cheapest and most straightforward and what they would build for any client if they were hired. And so they gave us this. So that gives us a baseline. We know how much that costs. We know that it has the program, we know that it's buildable, and we know that it solves everybody's problem. We just know that it's not anything worth building because they've already built 100 of them. I think normally architects would do this and would stop here. Since we were who we were, we continued to make models. Now, if you go to New York, a lot of the lower buildings have bay windows, and they're nice. You you go to a room, you go toward the bay window, and all of a sudden you're in space, right? And you sit down and you feel like you're outside and you're closer to the world around you. So we decided to play with the bay window. And by adding the bay window as an element that somebody would like and would maybe pay extra for, we could afford to put some money toward. We could rationalize doing what we were doing. Since the floor plans were duplicates going up, if you put the bay window in the same place in each room, the exterior would have a line that would read, a bump that would stick out and would be continuous. And we didn't want to do that. So we wanted to have the fabric look like it was blowing in the wind. For this building, as I mentioned earlier, we were trying to come up with a language that resonated with the older buildings around us. And we were also trying to get some feeling into the building by with the curtain wall, that it would have a humanity to it, that those faceless buildings that are all over the world don't have. There was a young lady working in my office who was a Princeton graduate, very smart, like young gal. And I said to her, she was working on this model, and I said, do you know the difference between Bernini curves and Michelangelo curves? And she said, yes. And so I said, could you do Bernini curves on the facade at this scale? And the difference is that Michelangelo curves are soft, and Bernini curves are kind of edgy. So if you see the Santa Teresa sculpture, one of the best ones by Bernini, that's an example of what I'm talking about. She made that maquette, and then we blew it up and used that. The building does have a humanity character to it. People tell me they like that, and I like it. I try to work with context as an important part of it, and I think Paris got built, and they built Paris à côté, they called it. It's La Défense, so they built all the modern stuff at the end of the Champs-Élysées, and so it's got its own world, and it doesn't interfere with the 19th century Paris that we all love. So you have both. There's a lot of ways to do it. I think it's just a humanity thing, a sensitivity to it. I'm not suggesting that we all make 19th century buildings. I'm far from it. I think I'm talking about humanity scale that the 19th century respected, and we should also respect. These places are for people. The scale of a tower in Manhattan is determined by economics and zoning, and by the feel of the tower or the space or the building can be iconic and self-referential, or it can be a friend to the neighbors. You can talk to its neighbors. It can become part of a neighborhood. In the case of the Beekman Tower with the Bernini folds on it, I was looking for a way to talk to the Woolworth building that was nearby and to the Brooklyn Bridge. So I tried to talk to and make an ensemble with them. So the terracotta bands on the Woolworth building are a certain width, and I used that same width for the Bernini folds on the Beekman building. The Woolworth Tower had breaks like the New York towers did. You go up a certain number of floors and there's setback, and then there's another section and there's another section. In the case of there were two breaks in the Woolworth Tower, so I made two breaks on the Beekman Tower. Our building's bigger, so it's got to be laid back a little, so it's not overpowering the Woolworth building. The ensemble, when you photograph it together, does work. You see a relationship between Woolworth, Beekman, and the Brooklyn Bridge, and it sort of talks. And that, for me, that's kind of an ideal city model when you're working in dense cities, that somehow everybody's trying to be an iconoclast. You get one kind of city, and then everybody trying to even be an iconoclast, but even be a friend at the same time, creates another kind of city. So I think they're not mutually exclusive, and it's something worth considering for the world we're building, because most people don't like what the cities look like. So maybe there's another way. When you're designing a new neighborhood, the scale of the scale you select or work with starts with economics, of course, with the program that relates to the land value, relates to the marketing, and all that kind of stuff. And that's serious stuff, and that does dictate a lot of thing about heights and all that. But there's a lot of variety within that. And that's up to us to discover that, to explore that, to try different model groupings and try and see how they fit. The new Grand Avenue project is a commercial building, it's apartments, it's got retail, it's got a hotel. We're creating an interior courtyard that will be an interesting partner to Disney Hall. We could have had one tower which had the hotel, condos, all in one building, and there are tall buildings like that in that neighborhood. So we could have made a selection that dealt with the taller buildings that are downtown LA. We chose to make an assembly of buildings that were a mid-range, that were more like communal with the music center, with the buildings, the public buildings in that neighborhood, so that it could relate to the park and to City Hall, and could eventually be developed at a mid-range, and leave the high stuff for downtown LA, because this was a slightly different district and had a different body language. And so that was a choice we made. So we build a model of all of downtown. We have the whole thing. So when we put something in there, we can see it in relation to the bigger picture of downtown. And it becomes clearer. Lay people can see it. You can begin to see a pattern. You can begin to see a sense of humanity that works with the cultural center that's different than with the financial district. They're two different things. You make decisions based on human scale, so you try to keep them user-friendly for those kind of activities. So you don't want to be at the bottom of a 70-story building because you're not relating to it. So you want several buildings. You want a cluster. You want to create a courtyard. You want to create landscape opportunities. You want to have nice signage. You want some sculpture. You want music outdoor. And so it's all the things that make it human activity inviting, that are supported by the cultural activities and support the cultural activity, because it works both ways finally. Once you create one of those spaces, it happens. And New York has Lincoln Center, and they did it their way. We're doing it our way. You got to sort of get focused on something you want to accomplish, and then you just doggedly figure out how to make it work. we started playing with white brick. And how do you make a brick house that doesn't feel like a brick house? How do you make it so it's kind of, it looks like a fabric, not a, and yet you retain the brick quality, but yet it's softer. And so we've been building mock-ups of that, and with various types of brick, with normal brick that's glazed, which is nice, has a nicer humanity to it than fabricated white brick. So it's all of those issues that you start to play with. We have a boneyard outside the office where we keep playing with those materials. Our biggest research is in glass, because when you do an office building, how do you get a feeling of glass that has a humanity to it, doesn't look like all the faceless glass buildings that are being built all over the world? And how do you deal with the energy issues of the glass? And and there's a lot of subtlety there. And so we build a lot of glass mock-ups, and we work with a lot of glass companies to get samples. Like in the Barry Diller building, we had no idea that you could cold bend the glass to 6 inches and get a curved glass wall for free. You didn't have to cast it. And in order to vet it, we had to go to the insurance company, and because it was a double wall, it was a sealed unit with double glazing, we had to get an approval from the insurance company as to how much bend they'll allow. They said 4 inches. They wouldn't allow the full 6. So we made Barry Diller's building 3.5 as an extra insurance to make sure that we were covered. I think that's the level of detail and that you have to get into. You have to be willing to get into that. You can't just slough it off. There are breakthroughs in form, like Zaha Hadid and others have done, that are interesting. But also there need to be breakthroughs in the materials themselves. We're always looking around for materials. There's a aerated aluminum that's made for blast protection on Humvees. And it's very beautiful, and I got all excited about it and started playing with it, and it's aerated, and some of my clients got all excited about it too. In this case, it's a building in the south of France. It's a 15-story building. It's not an office building. It's a foundation, so it has artist studios in it. It has a library. And we wanted the southern light, the French light, to caress the material and paint with it. I always like to think that the light is, if you use the material right, the light paints on it. And we made maquettes large scale of it and realized that the cellular quality of it sucked all the light out of it. And it wasn't as friendly from a distance. It had a kind of a dour look to it that we didn't expect. So we abandoned it. I had a building that it would have been possible to use it on, where it was simulating in the Pyrenees, where it would be simulating a rock outcropping, and that there it could work, and it would be light and would be a wonderful material to use for that. When I was doing Disney Hall, I was thinking about a building that you go to in the evening, and a building you go to in the evening would have been stone, because the ambient light in the neighborhood, without putting spotlights on it, would be soft and mellow. That project was shelved for a while. In the same period, we did the building in Bilbao with titanium that was quite fortuitous. Titanium was dumped on the market by the Russians, so it was underbid stainless steel. So it was we took advantage of it, and it worked really well in Bilbao because titanium was buttery looking in gray light, and Bilbao had a lot of rain and gray light, and it worked. Fast forward, Disney Hall, they couldn't afford the stone. They liked Bilbao. Titanium was too expensive, so we had to use stainless steel. The stainless steel we studied endlessly to get the right texture, the right feeling. It's difficult to light stainless steel at night. It can look like a cheap refrigerator. So I was constantly aware of that. And then budget crises came along and they didn't light it properly. So that's still an ongoing saga of how to light that building, which if it had been done in stone, it would have been mellow and soft and blah, blah, blah. I think you have to spend time with the mechanical systems people, find out what leeway there is there, what can be done within budgets, what can be done that doesn't lead to ugly stuff all over your building. As part of this process, you have to cost estimate what you've done. You have to get a clear picture that they can afford what you're showing them. For instance, in a house we used geothermal. We did it because we wanted to see how it worked, and I was paying for it, so it was on my nickel. And what I got is a house that's very quiet. I didn't expect that. And you walk in and you don't hear any motors or anything, and it's a very, very special feeling. That was a byproduct. Now, I didn't expect that. Is it worth doing? I think in my lifetime on that house, it won't pay off. I won't ever pay back, but it makes me feel good that we did it, and it's comfortable. So you have to weigh all those things. Now, when you're doing work for a client and they're paying for it, you have to be straight with them and tell them all this and tell them what those options are, and tell them if you want, I can show you an example how quiet this can be. Is it worth an extra $100,000 to do it? They may not want it. They may say, well, we're 75 years old. We're not going to be around that long, so not worth it. It's all these kind of human decisions come into play. And I can't say enough times that you must seriously control the budget. You must make that a value. Now, the client may say, look, I want to spend more money. Okay, but you gave me this amount. This is what it's doing. This is how it is. If you want to spend more money, make the room bigger, fine. If you want to add marble, fine. But this is kind of the way I see it. So you ballpark it so they have an idea of what they're getting from it, because people don't realize construction cost. And I think, Mr. Architect, Mrs. Architect, you have to be willing to understand that. I'm careful in who I sign up with. Maybe that's not normal in our field, but I try to understand the people and what they're involved with, what their intentions are. When I sign up to do the work, if I don't feel comfortable, I pass. I try to figure out who the person is, what their intents are, what their experience is, what they've done, what they're interested in. Because once you get into it, you're spending a lot of time with the people. The way I work, it's very personal. In the first few months of working with a client on a building, you get to know them, you get to understand what it is they're looking for, why they want to do this, and why they're taking their hard-earned savings to spend it on it. And you have to respect all of that. You can't ignore that. That's That's a big deal. Doing houses is very difficult because it's usually a couple. Quite often they have differences of opinion, and quite often the process of working on their house brings out the worst in them, and quite often they split, and you get caught in the middle of it. I've had it happen a couple times. Sometimes it gets very personal and funny. We try to keep it light. One should probably spend some time visiting their house where they live and see what they collect, what they hold dear to themselves, and try and get a sense of who the people are, what's important to them. And then the functional issues are pro forma. You got to know what their budget is and what their program is. Do they want it all in very close quarters, or do they want it a little bit spread out? What's the land like? Can they spread out? If it's tight, should they be on 2 floors? Discuss the neighborhood you're in with the client. Point out to them the kind of aesthetic surround that they're in. Talk about the landscape, what kind of feeling in the garden or the relationship to the outside. They want it to be more private or more open. If you think about them, they're really kind of obvious that you want to know all that before you start designing. I make models of the site, models of the surrounds, blocky models of the program, and set it on the site and start to explore relationships with the clients with the blocks, so that, where the bedroom relates to the living room. You sort of play with blocks for a while as a way of talking about the program. The sketch models, the blocks, we do them quickly, so you can run through 20 of those in a couple of weeks. The blocks are made to represent the scale of the rooms. You make these blocks and sort of guess where you're going with it. In that way, you can see how much of the site is covered within the boundaries you're allowed to build, and you can decide on putting it a second story so you get more garden. The most difficult part is the person gets into the personal stuff, how they really want to live, which way they want to face their bed. Everybody has a superstition about that. They don't tell you about it until it's too late sometimes, and all that stuff got to come out. And it does anyway, but it's better if it all comes out in the beginning. And that's what makes it exciting. And you talk about materials and that they like and materials that they don't like, and colors that they like and don't like. I use a lot of wood. I have some clients that hate wood. You don't use wood. I've noticed some of my colleagues just come in and show them the model and say, this is it. Financially and emotionally and from a sanity point of view, that's the right thing to do. The way I do it is precarious, but it does lead to a better project where the people feel, a lot of clients feel that they designed their house themselves when I'm finished with them. I think, like everything, be very thorough so you know what the facts are and what the people are looking for. You're designing for somebody, so remember you are. Be parental. Act parental in the equation. Don't be the, okay, sweetie, thanks for your nice things. We'll talk to the contractor. They know how to. Don't get into that role. Stay parental. Stay on top of it. And if you take charge and convince them you know how to make this thing work within their budget and that you're controlling it, and that you're watching it and you talk about it with them, give them encouragement about it and give them comfort that you're on top of all those things, you'll do your best work. You'll get your best work done and build the best work that you possibly can. The profession has gone the other way, so this will be a breath of fresh air for you young people coming out to take this approach. My father used to tell me I wasn't a businessman, so I assumed I wasn't a businessman. I've run an office since 1964, and it's been profitable, and everybody gets paid, and everybody gets a Christmas bonus. That's since 1964. I started out with that personal mandate that I wasn't going to have free labor, because that's a disease that happens in the profession. A lot of people get work by doing a lot of free work. And the way they get to, if they can't afford to do it, they get a lot of student labor and don't pay them very much. And it's a slippery slope, and I've never done it. Even the youngest intern that comes to my office, even though they don't expect to get paid. I don't borrow money either. That was the other thing I didn't do. So I didn't have any, but I didn't borrow it. The little house that got me all the notoriety, I only spent $50,000 on it. You don't have to be super rich to do this stuff. I think you have to have the heart and the will and the tenacity to not fold under pressure and to understand your responsibility in the game. So that's the business model, if you want, if you call it that. And I followed that, and it worked. I can tell you it works. If you have a sense of responsibility toward your client, toward making a building, toward creating, you also have to have a responsible construct in your own office so that there isn't a failure along the way that puts the client at risk. So there has to be a sense when you're being hired that there is a responsible financial entity that's not going to fail at a crucial point in the relationship. So running the office responsibly so that it has that financial integrity is really important, because there are a lot of my brethren who don't pay attention to it as a priority. That meant I had to work a couple of all-nighters and do a lot of stuff because I couldn't afford the first project. Slowly, it became possible to hire people, and slowly it became possible. But creating that discipline has worked for me, and it's not a get-rich discipline, probably, but it has been a solid financial discipline. That's something I'm really proud of, that we've been able to do it. I don't talk about it very much. It's probably one of the first times I talked about it. I was trained in the 50s and was fortunate to have teachers that talked about how you build buildings. And so that the design process included constructability. If the architect doesn't have complete control over the budget and constructability all the way from beginning to end, and is not the sort of the master builder, then 9 out of 10, they would be over budget, and then the owner freaks out and the owner turns to the contractor. And the contractor and the owner then concoct ways to reduce the budget, and the architect's marginalized in that conversation. So that now the American Institute of Architects has proposed a model of the architect, contractor, owner being partners in the development of the building, which sounds wonderful, except inevitably the owner and the contractor will prevail and the architect will be marginalized, because the contractor can always say, well, that costs too much, or you can't do that. In the battle, in the heat of battle, so to speak, as these things are going on, it's easier to say that than to say, wait a minute, let's try to figure this out and see if we can realize with the architect's idea, there must be ways we can negotiate this, which is how we do it. You have to be prepared to challenge that, fight it, and fight it to the ground until they finally see the light and agree that they can do it for the budget. If the architect has done his job, his or her job well, they can prove that. I made the presentation of this building that had a lot of movement and feeling, and explained it in detail and what the intentions were and why I did it and how it got there. Talked about how to build it, and the client group, the board, applauded me, and I got a very positive response from them. They then, some of them turned to the contractor friend who was there and said, we love it, what do you think? The contractor, who I knew, in my office, in front of me, with all my people, with all the board, said, well, it's a great design, but you can't build it. So that was a non-starter. Fortunately, the way we work, we're very thorough, and I think this is the important thing, is to not be caught like that. We had carefully gone through the most difficult parts of the building to build and had mocked them up in actual full scale and solved technically. We'd mocked them up in our parking lot. So I invited everybody, including the contractor, downstairs to look at the parking lot, to look at these complications which the contractor said could not be built. And we showed it to him. He looked at it and said, oh, I didn't know what you meant. That contractor, unfortunately, is out of business. I'm still working. Give confidence to the people who are paying for it, that they're on the right path with your work. I think that's really important. If you're going to be in this profession to build buildings, you got to know how to build them. The construction industry is at least 30% waste. If you talk about global warming and you think about the amount of waste in the construction industry worldwide, equate that to energy lost and all that, it's a big number. Nobody's really paying attention to that. Our drawings are made in two-dimensional drawings for a three-dimensional building, which leads to misunderstandings. And those misunderstandings are built into the general contractor's pro forma of 15% for change orders. And every client expects they're going to pay that 15%, and they don't complain. And with the technology we have, we can overcome that and eliminate that. And we've done it now. We created a company called Gary Technologies and used aircraft software and have clocked savings in the 15 to 20%. The tower in New York, the exterior curtain wall, all the curves, was done with no change orders because of the clarity of the drawings and taking responsibility. When I started in practice, I couldn't afford a very big team. I was doing a little bit of teaching, and I met a young guy, Paul Lewicki, and he came to visit and started working with me. And a few people fell in, like we had 3 or 4, and it was small team, so we were very friendly. We went to lunch together and dinner and talked a lot and complained about everybody. And we built little buildings and houses and things. At that point, I had in mind that if somebody stayed with the office more than 5 years, they would become contaminated and would have a hard time regaining their own voice. This is my fantasy. And so I kicked them out at 5 years. I said, if you stay longer, you're damaged goods, so you got to get out and find your own way. And we did that to a lot of people, and they did go their own way. So over the years, I guess I've created a personal rut, I might call it, of how I work. That's kind of comfortable. We built a kind of a group of talented young people around us who I'm used to working with, usually with 3, 4, 5 years before they go off to make their own way. So now it's different than then. So now the office has gotten bigger. It took a long time to do it, but we developed a highly skilled technical staff that can really deliver buildings on time, on budget, and without flaws, without leaking, without all that stuff. In the early days, you couldn't have that team. People with that kind of expertise were working in big offices. They weren't risking their lives, their families' livelihood, and so on, but coming to work with weirdos. So it was hard to get high-powered technical people to work. It's not just going to the computer and creating a form and then building a 3D model of it and building it and walking away. Now, a lot of people do that now. Because of the computer, you can fool yourself that you can do it, maybe, but I think in the end, you need to build this credible staff that knows how to put things together and can pass muster in the field in foreign countries. Like we're doing a project in London, and my people are over there constantly meeting with the clients and developing curtain wall and construction techniques with them. That ain't easy. You need really skilled and experienced people to do that. And so I think you start slowly, but you got to focus on that as a value from the beginning. I love to know the people. They become friends. I'm interested in their development as well, watching them grow and see if there's an opportunity to help them build, because that helps the whole team when they can rise to the occasion. When I'm in the studio with them, I'm not the big boss and telling them what we're pretty friendly and talk pretty openly about what we're doing and what we're trying to do. I love it when there's a feeling of their involvement, and I know they're intimidated by me as we work. So I try to lessen that intimidation by talking to them and including them and making them part of it and riffing on their names or whatever I can do that comes to mind to make them feel like we're friends together working on this, and that I need their support, that I'm counting on them. I've always done that. And when you do that, they're part of it. So they are playing with the materials and the forms and stuff with me, and feel a communal ownership, I would guess, in a certain way. I know I direct it finally, but if you talk to them, I think you'll understand that they have feelings of being participatory. Developing participatory activity is really healthy. Even the newest kids, I'll invite them to say what they think. Sometimes it's relevant, sometimes it's not. It does create a sense of community then by asking them. They can think about it beyond the meeting and come up with ideas and say things like, hey, I don't like that. What are you doing? And I had one of the kids say that to me the other day. He's brand new. He's been here 4 weeks, and he's already telling me what he didn't like. And that was interesting because he's a talented kid. Then I brought him back later and said, what do you think? Is this any better? And he said, yeah, it's getting there, or something. So it's just a kind of an open system of being able to say things, not feeling like you have to keep your mouth shut. Does it lead to a breakthrough architecture change in a project? Sometimes. When I did Beekman, the tower, I had a young girl from Princeton, I think she was, a designer. She'd been here for months, a very smart gal. And I said to her, do you know the difference between Bernini folds and Michelangelo folds? And she said, yes. I said, would you please, on this little model, it was only like 1.5 feet high, would you put Bernini fold skin on the model for me? And the next day I came in and it was perfect. She had the model done. She knew exactly what I was talking about. And it became the model that then we messed with windows and then developed curtain wall for and everything. So there she was, a young lady collaborating because she knew she had her architectural history creds. She knew what I was talking about. She had talent. She could make the thing. She wasn't practicing architect yet. She didn't have all the experience, but she was able to connect with me on that building and that tower, and I think of her as part of that process that led to that, and I credit her for it. So I think that's an ideal that happens from time to time, and I love it when that happens. She went on and opened her own office, and I don't know where she is now, but that's a real talent. Courage. It took courage for her to do that, and I love that. I have tried as much as possible to be very candid about how I feel about what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, why I'm doing it. It's just one person's identity and idea, but I was hoping to share with students my life's experiences and notions and ideas and how they've played a part in the evolution of my work and what I continue to do. I hope it's a level of honesty that resonates and allows somebody to relate to, because I think we do relate to our other people through their honesty. And I hope that I've done the same here. You have to be curious. I've said that so many times. Try to find your own voice. Your own voice is you, and you're the only expert on it. And that's worth pursuing and finding. Now, you might not succeed with it because everybody may not like it, but at least it's you. You got to find your place in the profession, and there's a lot of different niches. You can be administrative, you can be design, you can be construction, you can be the business end. You can do a lot of different things, and I trust all those people that I have working with me. Find your way to become part of a group that's creative. Even if you're not designing it, if you're part of it, there's a pride in it. These collaborative efforts can be just as exciting as being the person doing it. Take your time, move into it slowly, learn how you fit in and where your assets are most valuable, and then build on that. If you look around the world, that's what people you emulate and think of as successful, that's what all they've done is just followed their instincts and developed their own personal strengths over time.